If the editor wants a book and likes a book, they can help it get through review. And so the editor is someone that you want to have in your corner. So it makes it really important to choose your editor wisely. So the process for writing and publishing a book then is, you have your idea, you do your research, you write either all of the manuscript or a portion of the manuscript, and then you consider approaching editors. So, based on the experience from my 3 books, your mileage will vary here. If it's your very first book, you probably want to have most of the manuscript, if not all of the manuscript, written before you approach the editor, knowing that you're going to have to make some revisions, and likely some substantial revisions depending on how the reviews come back. So you have to figure out your timing for approaching the editors. And then once you do, and you find an editor you want to work with or multiple editors, it goes out for peer review. And at that point, you'll either have to make some revisions or you'll get a contract. Either way, you'll have to make revisions, but some presses will give you the contract before you do the revisions. Some want to see the revisions first. And so this could depend on the press and on your field. It might also depend on what the reviewers say they want to see. So at some point, you're either going to make revisions or get that contract first. And keep in mind that the contract only binds you. It doesn't actually bind the press if you read the fine print. So it says that you as the author will give the full manuscript to the press, and the press, if the editor and the board think that the manuscript meets their expectations, they will publish it. So you want to read the fine print carefully, but keep in mind that the contract really binds you to them more than it binds them to you, but it's still a good time to celebrate when you get that book contract. And then you'll probably do some more revisions in there somewhere. Manuscript gets accepted, and then it goes on to production, which includes copy editing, working with the marketing department. They'll probably change your title, as creative as you think you are. The marketing folks know how Google works and how your book will sell. And so they'll almost always change it. Maybe they'll keep some kernel of your original title in there. But I always joke, my mom always asks me what the title of the book is that I'm working on. And I always tell her it doesn't matter because it's going to change anyway once the marketing department gets their hands on it. So I don't know the title of my books until after I hear from the marketing folks. At some point after copy edits, it'll go to page proofs, which means they set it up to look just like a book. And then they'll send it back to you after what seems like forever. And then you have a week or two to read through the whole set of proofs and correct anything that looks like it's out of place. And then you celebrate because you have a book. And then you share the news about your book. And then eventually you get the box of author copies of books in your doorstep. And that's a very nice moment. You give them out to all your friends, people who read the book for you, what have you. So, that's the process from proposal to proofs. But essentially, just to go back to and put a finer point on some of these things, and then I'll wrap up. With the proposal, when you're writing a book proposal, what you're doing is convincing the editor. The editor is your audience here. So it's an audience of one, and that's your editor. Convincing the editor that the book is interesting, that the book will sell, and that the book makes a contribution to your field. You want to pay attention to formatting requirements of the press, and you can get these online. They tend to be kind of field specific, and so they may vary. So I won't get into all the nitty gritty formatting requirements, but check the press website, and even better, ask colleagues for examples of book proposals that they've sent to a press before, because that'll give you a sense of what did they put in theirs, what did they emphasize, and how long was it, all that stuff. So ask around, do some background research, and then just convince that editor that this is a really fabulous book. When to approach the editor, first you want to make a list of potential publishers, and the helpful shortcut for this is to look at your bookshelf and your works cited page. So the books that you have on your shelf, who published those, which publisher printed those books, that probably suggests that your work is within their wheelhouse. So if you have a lot of Cornell University Press books, you might consider sending to Cornell University Press. Look at your works cited page. If you've cited a lot of authors who have published with Georgetown University Press, maybe that's the right press for you. Choose your timing. This is going to depend again on your field and your publication history. So if you're a first-time author, you probably want to have a substantial amount of the project done before you start to approach editors. But again, the editor is going to be your advocate throughout this process. If the editor likes the book has a better chance of getting through the peer review process. The editor will give you the benefit of the doubt if those reviews come back needing a lot of revisions. If the editor is kind of in your corner there, they're going to help you figure out how to make those revisions, which revisions to go with, which revisions to overlook. So you really want to have a good working relationship with that editor. When you think about the review process, often you have the opportunity to recommend reviewers to the editor, like send it to these folks. Take that opportunity if you have it and recommend folks whose opinions you really value, who you envision assigning your book, whose work you've read, because this is going to shape, the revisions that you'll make that'll lead to your ultimate manuscript. And so name reviewers. It won't always go to those people, but maybe it'll go to one of them, and that can make your finished product much better. And then almost there, second to last, when you negotiate the contract, think about what matters to you. Check out the royalties, make sure that they're what they should be. They usually are. Cover art was really important to me for the first book on sexual violence, because I've noticed that a number of the books on sexual violence have like a silhouette of a woman and basically kind of reinforce the notion that I was problematizing in the book in suggesting, hey, this is an issue that affects men too. And so it was really important for me in that first contract to say, I want veto power over the cover art. And so they gave me 3 options and said, okay, you can veto 3 different options. After, if you don't like any of those, we're going to choose. I liked the first one they sent. And so that worked out really well. But had the cover artist come back with like a silhouette of a woman, I would have vetoed that. So think about if you have really strong opinions about your cover, ask to have that put into the contract, veto power over the cover, because that's really going to be the first impression of your book. Also look at who's going to compile the index. If you're somebody who's going to be totally overwhelmed trying to make your own index, the press can usually contract that out. It's usually about $600, $700, depending on the length of the book, and it'll come out of your royalties in most cases. And so you don't actually end up spending the money. It takes longer to get royalties. And then the thing that was really important for my second book was the format. Is it going to be available in paperback at first, or is everybody going to have to buy the hardcover for a couple years? And if you're assigning it to students, you might want to make sure that there's a paperback or an ebook option to keep it more affordable for them. And related to that, you have some negotiating power over the price. Ultimately, that depends on how long your book is, but sometimes you can get the editor to kind of set the price for the book a little lower. If you mention, I teach at a public university, I'm cost sensitive, I don't want my students spending a ton of money on books, where can we negotiate the price of the book? So those were the things that mattered to me in negotiating a contract, and you have different things that matter to you, but just to give you some ideas of what might be in play there. And then, the last part is once the book goes to production, it can be helpful to get a sense from the editor, if they can give it to you, on the timing of the production process, since you are balancing teaching and research. So you don't want to get those page proofs back with a 2-week turnaround time right at finals and grading time. So you can kind of say to the editor, here are my weeks when I'm really swamped with grading. If proofs can be after this point, then that would be lovely. They can't always be that flexible depending on when your book is scheduled to go to press and when it went to production, but sometimes they can. In my experience, the editors have been able to be quite flexible, understanding that I am at a teaching position, and that I do have that as taking up most of my time. So, there are a couple things where there's some wiggle room. Communication is key. And again, just really having a good working relationship with your editor makes this process much smoother.
I will assume that whoever's attending today's presentation has some version of a kind of manuscript or manuscript in the making that they're interested in sort of sending out or getting eyes on, getting it published. And assuming that it's a sort of more finished piece, maybe than a kind of beginning piece. And so I would say that the first thing you really want to do, and this goes for, it doesn't matter if it's your first book or your 10th book or whatever, is to really think about fit. And I think this is really, Kerry talked about it really well in the sense that sort of look at your bookshelves, look at your own project. What is there a press that you've been drawing from, like Cornell or whatever, that you keep coming back to? Because I think in a lot of ways, my presentation, I'm going to kind of pivot between being an author, also being a reviewer. I've reviewed for probably a dozen presses at this point. So I have a sense of what editors are looking for, and also sort of putting on the sort of guise of being an editor, and to think about that, because it is in some sense about fit initially and at the end. And if you try to sort of align a project with a press that either doesn't have room or doesn't have interest, that it can be a really big problem. And the reason I want to sort of underscore this is some really interesting figures come out recently about university presses that, and I think some of you know this, but some of you may not, that university presses for the most part don't make a profit. In fact, they cost money to the university. There are only a couple of them that do make a profit. University of Chicago Press and Oxford actually both make a profit. And that's because Chicago has the Chicago Manual of Style, and that essentially bankrolls a lot of their list. And OUP has OUP Classics. Those of us in literature know sort of you can assign one of the Oxford Classics. And that's a kind of money-making operation. But a lot of the other ones, even at very prestigious universities, aren't making money. And since the publishing industry is in crisis because of that, because a lot of times they are publishing less books. The University of Chicago, for instance, even though it makes a profit, I think in literature publishes about 10 to 12 titles a year. That's not a lot, right? And that's across all fields, all sort of specialties in literature. So if you're looking for to publish, I think it's really imperative that you find a press that is sort of exactly right for you, because I think you can waste a lot of time and valuable resources, and I guess emotional energy too, chasing down something that isn't going to happen. So I think Kerry's advice is exactly the right one. Is there a book or a sort of something that you have worked with that has informed your own work that you can then sort of say, well, that was published by University of Pennsylvania Press, and I think my book is sort of like that book. And this will become important a little bit later on when I talk a little bit about how to sort of pitch your project. But I think fit is really, it's vital. And unfortunately, it's totally specific to your field, right? Kerry can't tell you what to do unless it's in her field. I can't tell you what to do unless it's in my field. So knowing what that field is and where the sort of pressure points are is really valuable. Just one quick example. If you work in theater studies, for instance, the University of Michigan Press is super strong, but the University of Michigan Press is not super strong in a bunch of other fields that are even in literature, right? So it's a sort of weird way in which some presses have made names for themselves doing certain kinds of things. And that's really incumbent upon you, the author, to sort of track down, right? Is there a field, does a press have a certain specialty? Are there series within those presses, right? And those are sort of ongoing series. Are they series that have closed? So I think before you do any of the rest of the work, it's about sort of finding a good fit, or where do you think you have sort of best chance? And that could be, 2 presses, it could be 10 presses, depending on the scope and focus of your work. So I think that's really important. Also, just be careful. I think some presses I think Kerry's sounded really dreamy, the way Kerry was describing her press relationships. I think some in the literature, at least, want to have what's called right of first refusal. So they will want you to only sort of send them the manuscript and not send it to anyone else so that they can consider it. Now, you may say to yourself, like, I'm not going to do that, but some presses are very territorial that way. And I think it's worth checking the fine print when you think about applying and saying, am I sort of stuck with you? And the process could be months and months and months, sort of in limbo, waiting for them to get back to you. So just think about that. There are sort of there's a truncation point where I think there are kind of 2 options at this point. If once you found the right press or right presses for you, the first one sort of pre-COVID was super, I would have said, no problem. You want to, at your major conference for your field, almost always there are editors there, at least there is in English. I mean, I don't know, maybe this isn't the case in other fields, but often there are editors there from exactly the presses that you'd be interested in. And that's the time to approach them, right, at the, the book display or something else like that, and to make a pitch. But for that, you really do need the moral equivalent of like an elevator pitch, right? You need something that's short and sweet. You need to not sort of be, dragging your feet and sort of umming and ahhing through there. So that, again, a little bit of legwork, but I think that's a great way to do it. and maybe in the future that way will exist again. I find that probably pretty unlikely over the next bit. So the other option is the sort of cold call. Now, not cold call, the sort of just a letter of inquiry. I think this is really difficult for first-time authors because you don't have a name for yourself. You do obviously have a name for yourself and the work that you've done, but you haven't published a book before. And editors are, I think, a little skittish about supporting projects where they don't think that the author is going to finish the work, or they're not going to be able to sort of do it in a timely way. So again, I think you can reach out, you should reach out, but it needs to be a pretty polished piece when you do send it out, comparing yourself to other texts in the field. And I think this is, it's sort of the 10,000 foot view. So it's not about sort of getting into the minutia of your argument. It's really a sort of synoptic view of what you're saying, but it needs to not just be like, here's my argument, but this is how it's like and unlike these other texts in the field. And this is why it's important. And I think that's a piece that often is missing from proposals because it sounds like a little bit sort of combative, like you're sort of like, this person gets this wrong, this person gets this wrong. And I think, you can definitely massage that language, but it definitely needs to sort of clear some space and clear it quickly to establish that this is a manuscript that adds to the field by not simply being like this, but also doing something different than these other texts out there that are also. So, I mean, it's just it's a tricky genre to write in. Because we have all been taught how to be very subtle and precise. And this is a little bit sort of, this is a broad brushstroke, sharper elbows moment. Convincing, as Kerry did, sort of convincing the editor that this is something they need to publish. But one of the ways you convince them is saying, this is the state of the field and this is what's missing from it. So then you would sort of go on and you'd say sort of, the method that you're using, whether it's sort of highly theoretical or archival or data driven or interdisciplinary, and they're going to want to know that as well. And that may be part of the argument for why you need to write, why they need to publish this book, because you're, engaging in or constructing a more innovative method for doing X, Y, or Z, but that's something that needs to be spelled out. And then I'd say the other part of the letter that is absolutely crucial, but often gets kind of dropped, is a kind of way to talk about your record of publications so far, especially if you're a first-time author, right? It's a little bit sort of journal checking, but you want to say like, what piece of this has already come out in X journal, another piece of this has come out in Y journal. I because of this work, I was awarded a fellowship or a grant or something else like that. Just to let this signal to the editor that the work you're doing it's already making an impact. It already has legs, as it were. And I think that's important to do. And then you would basically talk a little bit about the state of the project. I mean, as Kerry said, with second books or third books, I think you're given a lot more latitude in terms of what you can do. In the first book, they're going to know how many words is it. For my first book, it was how many images there were, because images are a whole other thing, slightly tricky, which I have mixed feelings about doing that, but ultimately was a good thing. And they want to know sort of where else it was published and things like that. So I think you do yourself a favor if you can really just kind of drill down in that first paragraph and make it sort of snappy and clear. Save the subtlety and the sort of nuance for the actual manuscript itself, right? That's when you can sort of be much more circumspect and in terms of laying out your argument. But here it's more akin to what Kerry and I have talked about with people in the sort of grant mentorship program. Like, it needs to have a kind of, the genre of the grants is not the genre we write in normally, and it's a difficult one sometimes to kind of inhabit, where you are kind of, you're making broad claims that you and your professional brain say, oh my God, this is way too broad for what I actually saying. Like, how can I possibly say that? The paragraph in your pitch letter is exactly the part where you want to be saying that kind of stuff. You want to say it broadly, catch that editor's attention, situated in its field, show what's new and why that newness is important. And then I think, I don't want to sort of ramble on too long, but sort of echoing what Kerry said, then, if the editor is interested, the editor will send it out to readers anonymously. Actually have a totally different view of this thing, Kerry. So I think just worthy to sort of keep these two things in mind. I was told by an editor one time that every time you mention someone to send it to, they X that person out, and they're basically like, I'm not going to send it to someone or you've worked with before. I don't know if maybe that was like some sort of super ninja move that I didn't understand, and then they actually were sending out to those people. But I would, something to think about in terms of whether or not to include that or not. But it will go out to readers, and the readers will sort of, give it thumbs up, thumbs down. And I think if you switch hats to what the editor does at this point, right? The editor, if they like your project, which I'm assuming since they send it out and they're going to be paying these readers, at least in the humanities, to read your manuscript, that they like it enough that they're interested in you, in the project succeeding. Having an editor sort of in your corner, as Kerry said, is really vital at this point, because they have a lot of power, but they don't have the ultimate power, right? So the readers come back, and if the reader reports are positive, I think the editor, that frees them up to sort of go and make that case. If they're mixed, if they require substantial revision, if it's sort of yes, but the editor can sort of say, well, we're going to send it out. We're going to sort of let you have a chance to revise and send it back to these readers. What happens sometimes, which I've seen, is a split decision, right? So a reader is very excited about a project, and another reader is sort of, for whatever reason, really down on that project. What happens at that point, if the editor, again, this is about sort of building this relationship, as Kerry was talking about with her editor at Georgetown, the editor can sort of push through, and the editor might say, I'm going to send this out to yet another reader. Because ultimately, and I think it's important for us to sort of think about this, because it's different than, say, a journal article with a journal editor. The editor at a university press, and this is what I'm thinking of, particularly university press, has to make a case, has to sort of make the argument to the board. In the case of Oxford, it actually has two boards. It has an American board and the British board, so it has to go through both sets. And what you are doing by sort of addressing the reader's comments and you're sort of helping that editor build a case to go to the board and make that case, right? This is a text that we need to publish for these reasons, right? So having that really good relationship with the editor and thinking about it in that way, sort of giving the editor ammunition to make this case. Some editors are very savvy at this. Some younger editors might need more case making on your part. And, even if it doesn't turn out your way, so even if, some editors are very gun shy about, say, like two, sort of okay, but not enthusiastic responses. And they may say, I'm going to reject this. You always get those reader reports, and that's something really valuable. Unlike a lot of things, I think you get feedback, no matter if you do send it, if it's sent out to readers and the readers give you reader reports. And usually an editor will give you a chance to sort of process it, talk about it, even, make your case that, no, this reader got it wrong. And sometimes editors will be like, you're right, this was like a totally off the wall review, and I'm going to send it out again. But again, it's about sort of picking the right fit for your book, getting a good sense of the editor. This is someone who's going to be working with you. And you can ask around, who is it, what editors are really particularly good at this, and those are kinds of things to think about. So again, don't want to retread too much. I'm sure Case has other things he wants to do here, so I'm going to sort of pass the virtual baton on to you, Case.
So having the distinction to go after Kerry and Matthew, as Melinda said before, actually, I'm working on my second book project now. It's in production. It's about to happen. So that's a wonderful thing. But the first one was actually while I was in grad school. I worked with my advisor and two other colleagues. One was also a grad student at the time, and one was actually a professor. And we did a collaborative book project together. And so that was a different thing. And I wasn't, the power dynamics of being the graduate student and all that. I wasn't that involved in much of kind of the wrangling of the book project. So I'm going to focus mainly on my experiences in converting a dissertation. But even those folks here that are well past that, I think you can think of it in terms of, instead of a dissertation, but converting a research project, maybe that's an article or a series of articles, as you convert that back out to a book, because that's probably the way that I'll think about it in the future when I move on to my next project. So I'm sharing the screen and you can see my punny little, pardon me for entertaining myself here on Friday the 13th with my titles. But I do think it was kind of something interesting, the things that you find when you translate the work into a different format, things that weren't there, things that came about only with patience and with reflection and with distance. And I think that's an important part. And of course, we have tenure clocks, we have promotion clocks. So the idea that we can just sit around like Rasputin and rub our beards and wait for these ideas to come out is probably not, something that's a reality. But I do think that having a bit of distance from the project is invaluable. Allowing you to kind of read other people's work and see how it fit in. And I had so many epiphanies, and I just am very grateful for the time that I had in order to do it, coming from a dissertation and really thinking about the audience, right? Because the audience of a dissertation is of course the dissertation committee, and you're trying to please this group of folks that has their own politics and their own ideas about it, what it should look like. And so I think that moving from the stage of, this committee being your audience to thinking about who do you want your audience to be is empowering, right? And liberating. And I think that some reflection on just who your audience is in terms of discipline, in terms of, levels of education, like, is this a purely academic work, or is this maybe something that, could possibly end up in a Barnes and Noble for an educated lay audience. Perhaps that can be, a little bit of a pipe dream, but, it will shape the way that you think about it. And I think framing the audience at the very beginning while you're in this process of reflection and distance is very important as a place to start, and a willingness to rethink and question yourself and to update and to make new connections. And so, Matthew had mentioned things about the process kind of asks you to orient your work within this other work. And it says, well, this, it's not this, but it's sort of like this, and maybe these people got it wrong. What I've done, and there's obviously lots of ways to do it, what I've done throughout kind of my career in work is focus on connections rather than debates. And I know other folks in other disciplines have other ways to do it, and that's totally fine. But I do find it, being something that has been helpful for me to think about, I'm going to build on these work, and I'm going to bring together these disciplines that have maybe never been brought together before, this work that's maybe never been brought together before in a new way, and that can be my novel contribution. And it's just something that, a way that I've worked through, right? And I think both Kerry and Matthew mentioned articles as part of the process, and I think that is incredibly important, incredibly useful. I think it's, as part of the process of building the CV, it's crucial, right? Because in some fields, one book will not get you tenure. So you have to build on that with articles, and these can be a part of the process. So when the peer review system works, it can work fabulously, right? I've gotten such good reviews, and some bad ones too, and some infuriating ones, as we all have, but just some amazing reviews from folks that have allowed me to see my work in a different light and sent me off on these pathways that I never would have found on my own. And this is, I think, even more important when we become professors at a place like JMU, where most of us don't have graduate students working on these high-level research projects that we can kind of share with and keep in the literature with, right? We're just kind of here, kind of on an island a little bit, and getting peer review is a way to get that exchange and getting people to look at your work. So I kind of relished it, and I think that 2 or 3 articles as part of the book process is a great thing. Kerry and Matthew both mentioned the idea of, particularly as a first-time author, maybe writing a full manuscript. That's exactly what I did, and I think that that's what allowed me to get a contract with a place like Cambridge, coming as a first-time author, coming from a place like my PhD's from Louisiana State University. So I'm not a Harvard graduate or anything like that. And basically I said, look, here's this prospectus. And I put, at several points in there, I have a full manuscript that I'd love to send to you. This manuscript's ready to go. And so they don't have to take as much of a chance on you, because they can say, hey, we'd like to take a look at that. And so that kind of brings me to my next point too. When I was thinking about shopping it around, I was thinking in terms of series and series editors. And you can, with a series, it's a way to make these sometimes giant enterprises of university presses like Cambridge or Oxford or Georgetown or Chicago, and really narrow them down. And this way, as the others have said, to get it's important to get an editor in your corner. If you have series editors that are also in your corner, now you've got a whole, team that are working on your behalf, and they often handle the review process, and that can just, help you even further. So I was advised to really think in terms of series and what series this could apply to. And it gets a little bit tricky when you look on the websites, like, who do I send this to? Do I send it to the general editor, or do I send it to the series editors? If you send out a prospectus, they'll make sure it finds the right people if there's not, an email address right there. So I got some pretty good advice from senior colleagues. I tried to shop that around too, because a lot of that advice is kind of dated. If you talk to very senior colleagues, the publishing world has changed a lot in the last couple of decades as we start to go online with a lot of ebooks and things like that. So it's a little bit different than they used to be. So I would keep that kind of stuff in mind. And just at every step of the way, the process of reflection, not just the audience, but what kind of conversations do I want to be in? What kind of disciplines, what kind of subfields, right? And then that could, as Matthew was saying, that could lead to what presses you would use, right? Because they're going to have, certain presses are going to have, even within fields, these subfields and series related to that, where they're going to have more experience, and the comfort level will be a little better, and your book will end up having a little bit more exposure. And then the discussions about multiple presses and going under review in multiple places, I think we're really spot on. One thing to think about though, if you're just sending out a prospectus, you can pretty much send that to as many folks as you want, right? And kind of just scattershot. And it's okay then to shoot for the stars, but also be realistic and just see if you get any bites, right? And then you may, that way you might be able to order and preference like who you want to go with. If you send out 4 or 5 prospectus emails and a couple of them come back, then you can kind of begin to rank. And then as I mentioned, I think that crucial in my getting a contract was having the full manuscript at the time of prospectus. I don't know that they would have taken me very seriously had I not had the full manuscript. And then having a series also gives you this kind of this sort of committee that's reviewing your work, right? So the way that it worked out to me was they said, okay, yes, we would love to see your full manuscript. And then these 2 series editors plus the general editors looked at it, and they had a conversation about it and said, yes, we'd like to send this out for review. So it wasn't just like, this one person kind of skimming it over, but they actually spent some time on it. And I think, getting back to what series and how to think about it and the audience, things like that, the intro and conclusion for your full manuscript are incredibly important. And this is where you really can make direct connections and kind of direct arguments that you would like to be a part of, right? The conversations that you want to enter into and the subfields that you want to enter into, because a lot of times the substantive chapters of the books can be in certain disciplines very focused, maybe very empirical, right? But in the intro, you can make these broader theoretical connections that frame it in a different light. And that's just another way to think about your options in terms of where you would send it, right? And I think too, it's important to tailor your prospectus and especially tailor your cover letter. And the cover letter, I think, is, can be a secret weapon, because here's where you have basically one page to say exactly what you're trying to do. Even the prospectus itself can creep up to 35 pages or so. So people are going to kind of scroll through it. The cover letter, if the cover letter should be, your elevator statement, right? That really gets them, that hooks them. And you should tailor this to the various presses that you send it out to, and make it, kind of couch it in terms that they publish within, right? And you could even, I would think tailor the intro if you send out the manuscript to multiple places. Not a lot, not rewrite, but sort of think about the major theoretical arguments and broader connections that you want to make. You could switch that up a little bit and give yourself an edge, right? I looked at some colleagues' prospectus. I looked at colleagues' cover letters. They were incredibly helpful. And I think it's important to get multiple of those, because you'll, if you just get one or two, you may think, oh, this is the way to do it. And there's radically different ways to do it. And like others, I think that our attention spans are at the lowest level ever. You've got to get to the point in a hurry. You really do. And then just spend some time then on looking at the expectations of what the prospectus asks of you, because it can be radically different across publishers. I looked at a couple and was just kind of shocked. And so it's going to take time, right? But then I would think about it like I think about a grant proposal, in that you're taking the headings that come from their language and turn that into kind of like a checklist, right? So they say, we want you to have the marketing section, and we want you to, tell us how your book fits in these theoretical debates, a section called theoretical debates, right? Using their language. And maybe you have to tailor that to specific presses. But I think in the end, that's going to really facilitate their read and allow them to say yes, right? So just like a grant proposal, you just want to disallow them from saying no. The kind of the checklist approach. So that's really about all I have right there. And I would kind of reinforce something that Matthew said too, about getting into your prospectus some kind of award or previous work, right? Because this idea of external validation, that it wasn't just a dissertation that you're talking about here, but other people, senior folks in the discipline, have looked at your work and have given it some kind of validation, then is another way that allows folks to say yes to your work.